Welcome, fellow travelers, to the other worlds. Let us guide you while we explore the realms of fantasy, supernatural, and the paranormal, and meet with their storytellers, who transport us to other worlds and bring magic and wonder into ours. Let's open the portal to the other worlds and welcome our guest. My name is Sandra Tan, and today I am pleased to welcome Erika T. Wurth to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Now, this is a big week for you because The Haunting of Room 904 is out this week. And I read some interviews with you where you talk about your morning routine where you get up, you have a coffee, you walk the dogs, and then you write. And I was just wondering, do you have a release day ritual?
That's a great question, and no one's ever asked me that. I love that. Yeah, I used to write what you might call literary realism, right? And it went back to my nerd roots and started writing horror. That's probably a little fantasy and science fiction inflected. And so that's when I got, with a big five, right, which was super exciting. And I also now live in a big city. And so there are, Barnes and Nobles that carry my books. So last time with White Horse, I did go around to some bookstores and try to sign some books. And I think that's like just a nice and cool thing to do because honestly, Tattered Cover, the local bookstore, Barnes and Noble have both been so good to me. And it's like, it's fun. So yeah, that's probably going to be my ritual, plus a glass of wine.
Oh, that sounds like an excellent ritual. Well, and also, the day that the book comes out, even though it's just come out, it's kind of hard to focus on anything else, right? I mean, you're anxious to see how people are going to respond to it, and so it's kind of hard to settle down and you know deal with the nerves. So a glass of
Right.
wine sounds perfect.
Yeah.
So, you've talked in interviews now, because you've switched into horror that you said in one interview that I read that you wanted to learn how to create fear on the page. What is it about scaring people that appeals to you?
Yeah, and I love that question. And it's sort of like being funny when you're a poet. It's really, really hard. The goal, I think, is I hope to make people think or examine bigger topics. That's always wonderful. And with the background I have, like obviously I think a lot about those things. And there's, big subject matter in White Horse and 904. But getting people to feel an emotion is a primary human thing that can motivate them to do different things potentially to change their minds, to have a cathartic moment where they process their own fears or they process their own losses or grief, right? So I think fear for me on a baseline, there's a kind of perverse fun quality to it. Like I was that Stephen King kid. I watched Tales of the Dark Side. I was like a horror kid. I loved fantasy and sci-fi too just as much. um, but I loved that emotion so much. And I think as it's kind of weirdly rebooting, my partner's a thriller writer. And so he can watch or read or write about like, terrible acts of violence. But whenever he sees me watching something paranormal, he's like, oh God, oh no, I have bad dreams. Whereas it helps me to sleep because it's the one thing that, like, literally, no matter what's on your mind, if you watch a really great, scary film, it just chases all of that away. And so I think that's part of why I'm so interested in doing that for other people. And also, when it comes down to it, for me, like a slasher isn't scary, but something paranormal is really scary. And it's part of why I like about it. But it's scary because it's so other, it kind of leads to the other world, right? Like, is there life after death? Are there mirrors that are actual portals? Like, that's, even if the answer is a resounding no, it's an intriguing idea. And so ultimately, like, fear is the baseline emotion to get people to those experiences and questions. So yeah.
So have you ever written something that's scared yourself?
Yeah, it was really funny. I was in a panel, I was at the Tucson Festival of Books yesterday, and the moderator asked the same question. And I love to listen to David Lynch's soundtrack, Fire Walk with Me, specifically The Black Dog. I think it's Runs at Night. And it's a scary song. And so when I'm writing to that song, sometimes I do manage to scare myself. And I'm like, okay, cool.
Well, music is a great way of getting yourself into a mood, right? So if you find really scary music, do you listen to it a lot when you're writing?
I do sometimes need to get in that mood, and I do try to find scary music. Like I said, that one works for me just about every time. I definitely scared myself at one point during Whitehorse. I can't even remember which scene. And 904, I've already heard from fans that, they it was scary. They can't look in mirrors now, and I'm like, oh, cool.
Yeah, that it definitely has a little bit of an impact there. But we've all gone to places that have sort of creeped us out. And is that something that you're trying to tap into? Is that feeling that people have where, they can't explain what's going on or why they feel the way that they do?
Yeah, yeah, it was really funny. I had another at a signing yesterday. Someone came up and said, you have really beautiful writing, but I just couldn't finish White Horse. It was too scary. And I was like, cool, because other people think of it as really cozy, right? And it all depends on like what scares you and what your tolerance level is. Um, but yeah, I think there is just something to that. Like I said, for me, fear helps you to for a lot of things. For a lot of people, it's cathartic. For me, it helps me sleep for the reasons I described. And then I think the more interesting reason is it leads you to these very primary questions. And I think that's why I'm interested in it.
Well, and you've also created in The Haunting of 904, of Room 904, you've created this character, Olivia, who really was more of I guess an agnostic before, not really a believer in it, and then certain things happen and that flips a switch for her. And so it was that a deliberate choice to make her more relatable to people who are skeptics, or was that just something organic to her character that fit for her?
Yeah, I think for Carrie and Whitehorse, right, she's not a believer until it is right in front of her face. And a lot of it is because she's just this tough Gen X-y kind of like, small town, very funny, very hard talking, very pragmatic. She's very comfortable with her native identity. She knows who she is. She gets that. She's grown up with other natives, but spirituality is just not, she doesn't see a place for it in her life. And so that's why when it comes to her in this form, she's kind of forced to face it. Olivia, a lot of it is she just, unlike her mother and her sister, does not see the dead people, right? And, she's a sharp lady. Her dad's an aerospace engineer before he dies of cancer. And so when she decides to get her PhD in psychology, even though those are right, like a social science, it's still a science. And she's got a very exacting mind. And for her, she's never seen anything that would she would describe as paranormal. She loves science, and so why would she have room for that in her life? So she has a very different trajectory than say Carrie in my first book. But then by the time the novel starts, right, she's a paranormal detective because when her sister says, come to the Brown Palace or I'm going to die, and then she's like, "You're ridiculous. Calm down. I'm drunk. I'm finishing my PhD. Come to me." And her sister ostensibly suicides and then appears in front of her. And then other ghosts, like now her powers are turned on yet again, she has no choice. And so I think, yeah, I think it gives it a, if I can never say this word correctly, verisimilitude, verisimilitude. It gives it a sense of, you know, um, maybe not room for skeptics, but a sense of like, I'm not just like throwing you right in this world and saying, yes, you must believe it. It's a way for you to kind of journey with that character to something that at the minimum is hard to see and, at the maximum isn't real at all. Right. So, yeah, I think it's part of like pulling yourself into the truthfulness of that world, that feeling that it is true.
So you've talked about in a couple of different interviews, you've mentioned lights flickering when you stayed at the Stanley, and you said you had an intense experience at the Loretto Chapel. And I was wondering if you had a specific experience that influenced the haunting of 904, room 904. Keep leaving room.
Um, No, like no, and then see the thing is like I actually wanted to do the Stanley Hotel because I grew up right next to it and it was weaved very well into the project. I'm a big King fan, like a lot of horror people, right? And of course, The Shining, and that was a huge film for me growing up for a lot of reasons. So actually, I didn't have that experience before I wrote the book or before I decided to write the book. I decided to write the book, went to the Stanley for research, and had that experience. Whereas with a Loretto Chapel, which is actually part of what's my new book that I'm putting together, I had that experience twice and literally did not remember it the first time. Like literally, it was so weird. My brain was like, no, that doesn't, we're done. And literally went in the second time and had the same experience. But I don't generally have them. Usually, again, it's my auntie or my sister who has these kind of experiences. With 904, I was just intrigued by the idea because the Brown Palace, where I grew up really close to, and I've been many times right, for different events, they teas and gosh, all sorts of things. Um, the room 904, the whole story is there was this very famous Denver socialite. And, at the end of her life, after, she had a lover all of her life, she had a husband, the husband died. She thought the lover was going to marry her, married a younger woman. She got her revenge on him. He died a pauper. She gets older. She leaves her house, the Hill House, the famous Hill House, goes to live in room 904 and dies there. And so when I went to stay in 904, I didn't have an experience, but I got the tour and they were telling me that when they were doing construction, there were no phones in room 904, but they still got calls for it. And that just killed me. And I've heard those stories about the Brown Palace for years. And so I was like, this is a wonderful Denver ghost place to write about. So yeah.
So it's a great way to incorporate local lore into your work, and I'm sure that that adds some local interest. So, any plans to have a book event at that location?
Yeah, it's funny. My PR people have been reaching out to the Brown Palace, and I have a reading this Friday at the Tattered Cover reception, kind of at the Brown Palace. And but it's just sort of going to be like at the bar. But then the Brown Palace actually had my PR people had kept reaching out to the Brown Palace and they didn't get back. But then they actually reached out to my agent and said, "Hey, we'd love to do a giveaway." So now my PR person's like, "Yeah, let's do it." And they haven't responded because if they would do an Instagram giveaway around the book, that would be super cool. So
Oh, well, fingers crossed. Hopefully that will come together for you.
yeah,
So, something else about Olivia that I found interesting is that you seem to have given her your ancestry.
hmm
And of course in the book, um, the issue of racism comes up because of very dangerous and um, untruthful statements that are made by an alleged journalist.
right.
And I was thinking about that because I believe it was the Indigenous artist who created the shirt that I'm wearing, this design, who shared a few years ago mm, on a on Twitter when it was still Twitter. So anyway, who shared about going out and being accosted by somebody in the street who told them to go back to where they came from. And of course, they're Indigenous and they belong here. I mean, obviously. And I was thinking about that when I was reading the book because it really resonated that um, that there's so much prejudice and against people and particularly immigrants, but that carries over to the Indigenous community. Obviously, was that something that you deliberately wanted to explore? It feels incredibly timely given everything that's going on right now, and of course, you wrote this book some time ago because it takes months to and years to for books to come out. So, was it something that you deliberately wanted to tackle?
Sure. Yeah, I think that a lot of, look, I do know there's a native fantasy writer who actually doesn't really overtly engage being Creek, and I understand why, because being native is weird. But what I wanted to do was engage the big diversity in my small way in this book, and I'm always trying to do that, right? Because the whole fascination with Native Americans is, are you a real Indian? And I feel like why people do this and want to know how much you are, how traditional you are if you're full blooded, and this endless permutation, and why the Native community sometimes will pick this up in ways that I think aren't good for it, is because, the more that non natives can imagine that we are not really Native, the less guilt there is. And the more, we can be like, America can be like, well, we can take your land, we can take your resources, and you're not really Indian anyway. It doesn't matter, right? And you see this definitely with the current political landscape. But I think the other part of it is, as somebody who grew up right outside of Denver, like I grew up with Anishinaabe people, I grew up with Dene people, I grew up with Lakota people, lots of Lakota people. And so, and many, many Mexican indigenous people. And for me, I'm unenrolled, but it's, my family's from all these different places. Like I have Mexican Apache ancestry, they blended with Irish people. I have British Cherokee ancestry. I have Black Chickasaw ancestry. And at one point, someone was like, "Oh, you mean Blackfoot?" And I'm like, "No, I mean of African descent." And they all kind of conglomerated in Texas. And I think that happens in a lot of places. Like Texas is kind of unique in that way. I think there are a lot of people from my kind of background from Texas that aren't they don't really get talked about as much, and I wish they would. But yeah, like if you go to Chicago, you'll see a lot of Lakota and Anishinaabe mixes, and I met, you'll meet people who are like Alejandro in the book, he's Mexican, so he's certainly indigenous. Doesn't think much about it, but he is, and he's also black. We have my character who's Danae, and she's from the res, but she's a super genius. She's a Mensa member, and she's very ambitious, and she wants nice things. She wants a nice house, and she wants pretty bags, and she uses her brains to just sort of like get an easy life for herself, and that is her reality. Then you have my main character. She's a lot like me, right? Because I feel like for me, I'm never going to write a protagonist that's too different from what I am because I'd like to leave room for other people, like for an Anishinaabe person to write about Anishinaabe people. But I do want to have my main character, my side characters really reflect like the diversity that I've known in my life, right? And then, of course, there's the character who's the academic, who's kind of getting attacked, right? And then my main character is for other reasons, right? Because she's not really paranormal, right? These are all fake things. And then my academic character, who is Mexican Indigenous, and is being attacked for that, and now would be attacked, for purely belonging right in an ethnic studies or Latina studies department. So yeah, I think those things were relevant and are even more relevant, and they matter to me, obviously personally.
Understandable. Now, also, you talk about in some of your interviews, you talk about liking the accessibility of the written word and how that can make a difference in people's lives. And I was wondering about that in terms of the current climate. And are you worried about the way that things are going and the potential impact that that could have on accessibility to books at this point? And is that something that you even thought that we would be talking about at this point when your book came out? Because a year ago, I
Absolutely.
wasn't thinking about this.
I was absolutely thinking about it because the book banners that are now in in federal power, right, who are now literally withdrawing money from libraries, and they're trying to create lack of accessibility under this whole DEI mask, right? Everything's DEI and it's very bad, whatever they're pretending that means. But even for a number of years now, book banning has been a huge thing. I've been a victim of it. Lots of people have been a victim of it. A lot of it is, they're very conservative people that, they just not only do they not want there to be anything but like your white straight voice out there, male voice out there, but they also just, they're bored and they have the internet, right? And so they're able to do things that you couldn't do before. And they also understand like America has very specific buttons. Like they know if you're black, you can say, oh, they're stoking race hatred. If you're queer, they can be like, you're grooming children. If you're Native American, be like, you're not really Native American. And so there are these buttons that trolls know how to push that will push people. The people that I would highly suggest if you're like really into this and it matters to you, the people who are fighting are the ACLU, of course, but also PEN America. PEN America has reached out to me. They've reached out to a lot of people who've experienced like trolling, book banning, harassment, and they offer support. They're trying, they'll fight back legally. PEN America is one of the most important, I think, literary organizations in the world. So
That's incredible that they are advocating for you. And also, it's kind of shocking to me, like, and I suppose it's one of the things about privilege because you don't realize until you're the target of it just how bad that it is. And that's really unfortunate. And yet at the same time, you're dealing with this in this story, you're dealing with this journalist who is spreading all kinds of falsehoods, and there really aren't any checks and balances. And in recent years, there's been so much that's happened that's really discredited the media and ruined the integrity of a lot of presses and reporters. And I was wondering about that as well. Like, was that something that you were aiming to address? Although it's not heavy-handed, but these issues are woven in throughout, and obviously they're having an impact on Olivia because nobody's stopping this person and they are just blatantly saying whatever they want. And on the flip side of that, you've got these people who seem incapable of really analyzing information that's presented to them and verifying it. And they just go with it, which also seems to be a current problem. Was that something as well that you were tackling that was deliberate?
Yeah, it's really funny. My niece is 17 and she's a sharp girl and she's well educated. She's off to college soon and I'm gonna miss her. And she was like, Auntie, if something doesn't have an edu or an org on the end of it, it's probably not legitimate. And I'm like, if she knows this, people can know it. And even academics will sometimes share the most, and like these are people with PhDs, the most bizarre stuff. And I think it's because the internet is overwhelming. Like it is overwhelming for people my age who was not born with this at all. It's overwhelming for people who were born into it because then it's just this like matrix of information, right? And how do you really, and again, like trolls, which are now in control of the government, know exactly how to push people. So the thing that I learned once I started talking to other writers is that if you get any attention at all, and yes, certainly if you're a woman of color, that is like almost imminent. Although sometimes I've noticed kids authors don't get it, and then sometimes some of them get it way worse. It's really weird. um, you will probably come up against this. I have a friend, white dude, and I'm not going to say his name just because I feel like he's always trying to like just put this behind him. But he's a very well-known writer. He was writing IP for Star Wars and Marvel, DC, and because like there weren't a lot of writers of color or queer writers at the time, he was like trying to push these characters in there to like diversify the universe. They have never forgotten it. These right wingers, they have never forgiven him. And what they like to do is they like to do these, they start in these right wing spaces and then they try to say these things to get people on the left. Like they just create complete and utter falsehoods, but they know that the left will be triggered by them and retweet it and be angry. And I have seen this. And it's wild. Like they've done death threats, they've done all these things. Will these people ever show up? Almost never, right? Like I heard somebody did get actually heckled in person, right? Because there are crazy people everywhere, right? But what I'd also learned in talking to other friends who had experienced this, like there are a series of laws that just don't protect writers. Like, and it's actually worse than I put in the book. Someone on Twitter, or no, it's now Blue Sky. Now we're on Blue Sky, right? God, someone on Blue Sky pointed this out to me. I was like, oh my God, he's right. So what I talked about was the way in which Reagan eliminated the Fairness and Broadcasting Act, right? So before you had to have two sides, and if something was really unbalanced, right, you'd get a fine, right? FCC would fine you. He eliminated that. So basically, it meant like anything on TV or on radio, it literally could be under the rubric of the op-ed. It's worse than that, though. The person pointed out that magazines and newspapers have never been under that umbrella. And there is nothing that they can, like, we just have to assume, like, we have to know, like the New York Times, fairly legitimate, right? Like, yes, they have their biases or this or that and whatever, but overall, they check their sources, they double check their sources. They're just funneling it through an audience. They have a certain sponsor, right, financially, and they're funneling it through a certain audience. But mainly what you're getting is pretty good. You want to go though to like Associated Press if you really want something like, flatly factual. But there are no consequences for doing that because everything has always been able to be an op-ed, technically speaking. And so people were like, okay, what about defamation? Well, number one, in 1996, Clinton thinking, oh gosh, what is this internet thing? Well, I don't want corporations to be impacted by what they might publish with somebody else's, did Section 230. And it was recently upheld by the Supreme Court. And it means that anything that's published on the internet, the Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever, is not responsible for it. And so you can publish anything, nearly anything. And the last thing is called anti-SLAPP, and a lot of trolls know about it very intimately. And anti-SLAPP varies from state to state, but it means that if you are a public figure, whether you're Verizon or me, the bar for defamation is unachievably high. It's unachievably high. And so you have just so many laws ahead of you that don't protect you, that protect corporations, that protect a little guy, or protect trolls and harassers, and that don't protect you. So I did want to talk a little bit organically, as you say in the book, because it's something that so many public figures and certainly writers face.
Well, and it's interesting though in the book that because you have Olivia who is highly educated, and now you're talking about these issues where your niece can figure this out, but these other people apparently can't because they just don't have the critical thinking skills or the willingness, whichever it is, um, to actually investigate things before they decide what they believe. And so it's interesting that you're talking about that because it's a real issue that is affecting our day-to-day life now, not just in the book world, but everywhere because people have they see it online, they see it on certain news stations and they just take it as fact and then run with it. And so there's a moment in the book, and I don't want to give it away, but there's a moment in the book where Olivia takes some actions that may not be the most wise thing to do, but they certainly address some of the issues that she's facing as a result. And I really loved that because it was like she was saying, I'm not going to back down and I'm not going to take this.
Yeah.
I'm going to stand up for myself, which was really admirable, but also like really frightening because I could imagine that playing out in real life in a very scary way.
Yeah.
And and so in a strange kind of way, those real moments were almost more frightening than
Mhm.
some of the other things that were going on in the book. Like you're really delivering that fear factor on every level in her life.
That's why my mother always says The Shining is far more frightening because, yes, it has its supernatural elements, but the idea is, because there's so many, my mother was a victim of it. So many women have been a victim of it, children often, right? Of men who are violent and you can't stop them. They just keep going like nothing stops them. The law doesn't stop them. And it's sort of like this like hothouse version. But I remember years ago, my friend Stephen Graham Jones, right? My Indigenous, brother from another mother. He said something about why he loves monsters and why he loves slashers, and of course that's I do like monsters. I'm not a slasher guy, but I like the idea of like the final girl and why it's worthwhile, right? He's like, look, you run from a monster and you run from a monster and you run and you run and you run until there is that final moment where you cannot run any longer. And then you turn to face the monster and you must fight. And I thought, yeah, yes, that's about right. That's a thing I think I've faced, and I think that's a thing, my character Olivia faces for sure. So
Now, one of the things that I found interesting in your story was how really healing it is. Um, there's a lot of pain from, colonization and from generational trauma that's passed on, and then of course Olivia's even dealing with more modern losses and grief because of her sister and her father and the current threats that she's facing, and yet there's something really healing and about the story and the way that it goes. And I'm wondering how intentional that is in the sense of you can't go back and correct the past, obviously. You can't undo the Sand Creek massacre or any of the other massacres that you've written about and all of the terrible centuries of wrong that have been done. But you seem to be striving to give spirits a way to find peace. Is that like a personal goal to you in real life as well? Because you talk about wanting the native literary space to be more positive, and I was wondering really what you meant by that, and whether that was connected to wanting to move towards healing stories, or was it
yeah,
different?
yeah, a lot of things. So, being from Denver, I grew up like, obviously, to be respectful, I call it the massacre in the book, but obviously it's the Sand Creek Massacre. And I grew up only hours from the Sand Creek Massacre. If you read about it, you can see it is perhaps one of the most just brutal things to ever read about. I tried to handle it delicately because I just can't just it's not my place. And even if I were, an enrolled member of the Cheyenne, Arapaho Nation like my cousin is, and that's a lot of reason why it's on my brain too, because he's of more African descent and he's than we are, and he's also Cheyenne Arapaho, and now he's a citizen. And so obviously this has been on my mind. But yeah, I think it's disrespectful to not talk about it, right? Because it's like this is where it's right there, and that's what I wanted to show. Like, right as this socialite, right, is creating this sort of like fun social club in reality, and then in the book, this sort of like um, cult, right, around paranormal activities, and she's kind of interested in what natives can do for her, which is always a story. At that same time, there's, the Sand Creek Massacre. And as Denver is being built up and the Brown Palace is being built up and it's beautiful, this stuff is happening. And so I think it's important to remember, because what is more, what gives you more of a reason to write horror than genocide, right? Like, what could be more horrific? I think the healing part of it, though, is yes, I'm 49 years old. And so when I first started writing, there were very few Native writers. There was basically one, and they wanted to keep it that way, right? And they were really, really good at being the most authentic in the world, because ultimately they kind of were, right? They were from a res, both their parents were Native, they were working class. And so they were able to figure out, white people just loved that. Oh my God, he's a real Indian. Whoa, I love it. And he was just delivering that experience, and he was charming as hell, right? And the early work, I think, was quite good. And I think then they became like a powerful speaker. But what it did was it eliminated any other voice, like speculative voices, crime voices, people like me who may not be enrolled, but I'm from like a very typical Native background in Texas with Mexican Native and Southeastern Native roots. Like, it's pretty common, actually. I've had people email me and say, "Thank you for talking about this. This is my background too." And then you have people who are like, you know, yes, they may not be, it may be distant, but they are Choctaw or Cherokee, either citizens or just descent. And, it's a thing that matters in their lives. And then, they're Black natives and Mexican, you know what I mean? Like, I really wanted to see not just the demographic diversity, but the intellectual and creative diversity in Native literature that I knew existed in Native lives. We are readers. We do read. We read a lot of commercial stuff, but we're readers. And I think now now that so many natives are going to college, which is cool, we're reading more literary stuff too. But yeah, I really wanted to see that. And the healing part of all of that is, yes, I think it's important to talk about what's dark and terrible, right? And as a horror writer, obviously I'm going to engage with that. But what is the point unless even if it's fictional, what is the point unless you're saying, okay, here is my idea of a concrete path to reconciliation that will heal both parties, will start that healing process. And it really stuns me that there's so many people who see that as like aggressive or bad. Like, I'm friends with people who do that in Denver. Like, they are part of Native organizations that work to help with missing and murdered Indigenous, women, so that their crimes are tried, their bodies are found, or maybe they're found alive, even better. So those things like have real life concrete impact. And I think it's important. And it's important to talk about those things and see what the path forward is. So yeah.
Fantastic. Um, just to wrap things up, your new project is The Ghost of Lovett Chapel, and I was wondering if you can give us any teaser about that. What can we expect?
Yeah, I think it's tentatively called that. So maybe it'll end up being called like Ghosts or Haunt, or, I don't even know. Because the Loretto Chapel piece is probably going to move towards the end of the book. I'm working with an editor on that right now. It hasn't been sold, but I'm hopeful. And essentially, it's about a couple. They met at the Institute of American Indian Arts when they were babies. I was a visiting writer there for a year. And so I love that place a lot. Now they have a cool MFA program. In any case, so the couple met there. They had a baby too early, but they didn't let it stop them. They finished their degrees. They got MFAs in visual art, and they were professors at the University of Chicago for a long time. They finally are successful enough to move back to Santa Fe. But then, the female character, Daheste, because it's 2 points of view, starts to see stuff around the house. And it's this old house. She knows that the artist before them died in her studio. So she's like, is he haunting the studio? What's going on? She also knows that her father loved to go back to Santa Fe, but the last trip that they went to Santa Fe, afterwards he was destroyed. Like, he began hearing voices. He was also, an aerospace engineer. I keep that in both pieces. And because my dad was. And he starts to hear voices. He destroys his career. He starts drinking and drugging because he just can't stand it. He ends up bringing his wife down with him. She ends up drinking and drugging just to deal with him, and they both die. The brother is the main character is a gambler, and he calls her and he shows up at her house and he's like, I think I've killed someone. Will you take me in? And the husband's like, no. So it sort of starts with that, and then it's like, we'll see where it leads.
Ooh, sounds fascinating. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.